I never loved my husband. It was a truth I had carried inside me since the day we stood at the altar. My hands trembling in his, as we exchanged vows I didn't believe in. A truth that I swallowed every morning as I played the role of a devoted wife. Cooking breakfast, smiling at the right moments, lying through my teeth when he kissed me goodnight. Because I loved someone else. Her name was Elise. She was everything my life with Daniel wasn't. Passionate, real, unrestrained. When I was with her I could breathe. I could exist without the weight of expectation crushing me. For 3 years I had balanced between these two worlds. My marriage, a cage built by my family's expectations, and my love for Elise, a secret garden I tended in the shadows. I thought I had control. Until that night. My flight back home was earlier than expected. The conference had wrapped up sooner than planned, and rather than spending another night alone in a hotel, I longed for my own bed. Daniel hadn't answered my last message, but I assumed he was asleep. I unlocked the front door quietly, stepping inside with a deep sigh. The house was dark except for a dim light spilling from beneath the bedroom door. I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, and my world cracked open. Daniel wasn't alone in bed, and neither was Elise. The sheets that had once smelled of my perfume were tangled around their bodies. My husband, whom I had never loved, and my lover, whom I had given my heart to, were pressed against each other, their limbs entwined, their breathless gasps filling the space where I should have been. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My vision tunneled, my pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything but the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then Elise's eyes met mine. Shock widened her pupils. "Ava." Daniel turned his head lazily, a smirk curling on his lips. He didn't look guilty. He didn't even look surprised. "You're home early." His voice was calm, almost amused. I swallowed hard, the bile rising in my throat. What the fuck is this? Elise scrambled away from him, pulling the sheets around her. "Ava, save it." My voice came out sharp, laced with something raw and bleeding. "You?" I turned to Daniel, my hands shaking. "You knew." His smirk widened. Of course I knew. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. Elise reached for me, her face pale. "Ava, I never meant. You never meant for me to find out?" My laughter was hollow, brittle. "Or you never meant to betray me?" Daniel chuckled, stretching lazily. "Betray you? Let's be honest here, sweetheart. This marriage, it was never real." I clenched my fists. "It was real enough for you to use me as a cover. And for you to do the same," he countered smoothly. "The difference is, I never pretended to be a saint." I turned to Elise, desperate for an explanation that would make sense. "How long?" She hesitated. "Too long." Daniel answered for her. "Over a year. A year. A whole fucking year." My stomach twisted. The weight of it was unbearable. Elise reached for me again. "Ava, please." I stepped back, the distance between us turning into an abyss. "Don't." I turned on my heel and walked out. Behind me, Elise called my name. Daniel laughed, and I didn't look back. I drove aimlessly through the city, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The streets blurred past, neon lights streaking through my vision like a fever dream. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there. Not in that house. Not in that bed. Not in the same space where they had been wrapped around each other. Elise and Daniel, the two people who should have never crossed paths like that. My breath hitched, and I pressed down harder on the accelerator. The anger had started to settle now, leaving behind something hollow and cold. I had spent years building walls around myself, keeping my secrets safe. And now, in one night, everything had shattered. I pulled into an empty parking lot near the waterfront, cutting the engine. The silence was suffocating. My hands were still shaking. I thought about calling someone, anyone. But who? My parents, who had forced me into this marriage. My friends who thought Daniel and I were a perfect couple. There was no one to call. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, my breathing ragged. Elise had betrayed me. Daniel had orchestrated it. But the worst part? I had never expected anything else from him. I should have seen it coming. A sharp knock on the car window made me jerk upright. Elise. She was standing there, her face pale in the glow of the streetlights, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked terrified, desperate. I rolled down the window just enough to speak. "Why are you here?" My voice was hoarse, raw. "I needed to find you," she whispered. I let out a bitter laugh. "And do what?" "Apologize." She flinched but didn't back away. "Ava, please, just let me explain." I didn't want to hear her excuses. I wanted to hate her. I needed to hate her. But I unlocked the door anyway. Elise hesitated before slipping into the passenger seat. The scent of her perfume filled the car. The same scent that used to linger on my skin after our nights together. Now it only made my stomach twist. She turned to me, her hands trembling in her lap. "I never wanted to hurt you." I scoffed. "Then why did you?" She swallowed hard. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." I turned to her, my eyes burning. "Like what, Elise? When exactly did you decide that sleeping with my husband was an option?" Tears welled in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. "Not this time. I didn't mean to fall into this, Ava. At first, it was just curiosity. He knew about us. He confronted me about it one night when you weren't home." She looked away, guilt etched into every line of her face. "And he was charming, persuasive." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "So that's all it took? A few sweet words from Daniel, and you forgot about me?" "No." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away as if her touch would burn me. She exhaled shakily. "It wasn't like that. I love you, Ava. I still do." The words twisted something deep inside me. Once, I would have given anything to hear her say that. But now, love? I repeated, my voice flat. "You don't betray someone you love." Her tears finally spilled over. "I know, and I hate myself for it." "Good." Silence stretched between us. The city hummed in the background, life moving forward even as mine stood still. After a long pause, she whispered, "He wanted to hurt you, Ava. That's why he did this." I let out a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel. Of course he did. Daniel had always played games. I had spent 3 years pretending not to notice the way he manipulated situations to his advantage, always one step ahead. He had known about Elise and me. He had waited. And when the opportunity presented itself, he had taken it. And Elise had let him. I turned to her, my chest aching with something I couldn't name. "Do you love him?" Her lips parted. And for a second I thought she would say no. That she would give me something, anything to hold on to. But she hesitated. And that told me everything I needed to know. I nodded, biting down on the inside of my cheek to stop my voice from shaking. "Get out of the car, Elise." She looked at me, pleading. "Ava, get out." Tears slipped down her cheeks as she reached for the door handle. She stepped out, pausing for just a second, as if she wanted to say something else. But then she shut the door behind her. And I drove away without looking back. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I drove for hours, circling the city in a daze, my mind replaying every moment, every touch, every whispered promise that now felt like a cruel joke. By the time the sun started creeping over the horizon, exhaustion settled into my bones. I pulled into a small motel on the outskirts of town, paid for a room in cash, and collapsed onto the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling. I should have cried. I should have screamed. But I felt nothing. Just an empty, gaping void where my heart used to be. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, my phone was vibrating against the nightstand. I reached for it instinctively, but the name on the screen made my stomach churn. "Daniel." I let it ring. A few seconds later, a message popped up. "Come home. We need to talk." I tossed my phone aside, ignoring the gnawing dread curling in my gut. What was there to talk about? He had gotten what he wanted. He had torn me apart from the inside out. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. But Daniel wasn't the kind of man who accepted silence as an answer. An hour later, as I was staring blankly at the television without really watching it, a sharp knock echoed through the motel room. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. Daniel leaned against the frame, dressed in the same clothes from the night before, though slightly rumpled. His eyes flicked over me, assessing, measuring. "So this is where you ran off to," he said. His voice light but laced with something sharper. I crossed my arms over my chest, blocking the doorway. How did you find me? You're not as hard to track as you think. Of course. He had always been good at knowing where I was, what I was doing. It was part of what made living with him unbearable. He played the role of the perfect husband in public, but behind closed doors. He was always watching, always calculating. I exhaled sharply. What do you want, Daniel? He tilted his head, his gaze steady. You. A cold laugh escaped my lips. Is that what this was about? Some twisted game to win me back. He smirked. Don't flatter yourself. I've known for years that you don't love me, Ava. His fingers brushed the doorframe as he took a step closer. But that doesn't mean you get to just walk away. Something dark curled in my stomach. I never belonged to you in the first place. His jaw twitched. Didn't you? For a brief moment, I saw something in his eyes that almost resembled hurt, but I didn't believe it. Daniel didn't get hurt, he only hurt others. I squared my shoulders. We're done, Daniel. You got what you wanted. You humiliated me. You took the one person I trusted and used her against me. Congratulations. He sighed, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. Ava, you've been playing your own game since the day we got married. Do you really think I didn't notice the late nights? The business trips that weren't actually business? The way you looked at her? My nails dug into my palms. So what? That gave you permission to do the same. He smiled, slow and deliberate. No. It gave me permission to do it better. A shiver ran down my spine. That was the thing about Daniel. He never acted out of impulse. Everything he did was intentional, calculated. I had underestimated him, and I had paid the price. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I don't care what you think you've won. I'm leaving. His smile didn't falter. Go ahead. I hesitated, thrown off by his easy acceptance. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. But if you do, you might want to ask yourself how much you're willing to lose. A chill settled over me. What does that mean? He shrugged, stepping back as if he hadn't just dropped a bomb between us. I'm just saying, divorces can get messy, especially when one party has a lot more to lose than the other. My breath caught in my throat. You wouldn't I? He arched an eyebrow. Come on, Ava. You know me better than that. And I did. Daniel wasn't going to let me walk away without consequences. He turned to leave but paused in the doorway. You should come home. Think about what you really want. Then he was gone, leaving behind only the echo of his words and the sinking realization that I wasn't as free as I had thought. I didn't go home. For 2 days, I stayed in that motel, existing in a state of numb detachment. I ignored Daniel's calls, deleted his messages without reading them, and refused to let my mind drift back to Elise. But the world didn't stop for my heartbreak. On the morning of the 3rd day, I woke to a knock at the door. My pulse spiked, a part of me expecting Daniel again. But when I hesitated, a voice called out, Ava, it's me. Elise. A sharp pain shot through my chest, a mix of longing and fury battling within me. I should have ignored her. I should have let her stand outside that door until she gave up. Instead, I opened it. She stood there, looking exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. Her shoulders slumped as if the weight of her own guilt was finally crushing her. Can I come in? She asked quietly. I should have said no, but I stepped aside anyway. She walked in hesitantly, as if afraid the room itself would reject her presence. The air between us was thick, suffocating. I tried calling you, she said, her voice small. I leaned against the desk, arms crossed. I know. She looked down at her hands. Daniel told me he found you. I clenched my jaw. Of course he did. She glanced up, searching my face. What did he say to you? I let out a bitter laugh. That I should come home. That leaving wouldn't be that simple. That he has the power to ruin me if I try. Her face paled. Ava. I narrowed my eyes. Did you think he'd just let me walk away? She swallowed hard. I don't know what I thought. I never meant for any of this to happen. I pushed off the desk, anger rising. You keep saying that, Elise. But you let it happen. You let him win. She flinched. I know. The worst part was that I could see how much she hated herself for it. But that didn't make it hurt any less. I shook my head, running a hand through my hair. I don't even know why you're here. She hesitated, then took a shaky breath. Because I love you. The words felt like a slap. I let out a sharp breath, forcing down the emotion clogging my throat. Don't say that. It's the truth. I laughed, cold and empty. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. Her eyes filled with tears. I made a mistake, Ava. A terrible, horrible mistake. But I need you to know that it was never about him. It was about... She trailed off, looking away. About what? I pressed. She closed her eyes for a moment before whispering. About not feeling like someone's secret. The words hit like a punch to the gut. I staggered back slightly, gripping the edge of the desk. What? She looked up at me, her expression raw. I loved you, Ava, but I was always hidden. Always in the shadows. We could only exist behind closed doors in stolen moments. And I let myself believe that was enough. But when Daniel found out about us, he didn't treat me like something to be ashamed of. I felt sick. So you rewarded him for that? She shook her head desperately. No, it wasn't like that. I was weak. I was confused. And once I crossed that line, I didn't know how to undo it. I stared at her, my hands trembling. You had choices, Elise. And every time you chose him. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I know. And I hate myself for it. But Ava, I still love you. That hasn't changed. I let out a shaky breath, the weight of her words pressing down on me. She took a step closer. Please, say something. I looked at her, the woman I had given my heart to, the woman who had shattered it. And I realized something. I still loved her. But I would never trust her again. I exhaled slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. You need to leave, Elise. Her face crumpled. Ava, please. I turned away, unable to look at her. I can't do this. Not with you. Not anymore. Silence stretched between us, heavy and final. And then without another word, she walked out the door. This time I didn't stop her. I stayed in that motel room for another day, staring at the ceiling, trying to feel something other than the gaping emptiness inside me. But the world wouldn't wait for me to pick up the pieces. By the next morning, I knew I couldn't hide anymore. I packed my bag, checked out, and drove back to the house I had never really considered home. I didn't know why I went back. Maybe because Daniel had challenged me to. Maybe because I needed to see it one last time before I left for good. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, suffocating. The house was too clean, too quiet. As if it was waiting for something to shatter the illusion of order. Daniel was in the living room, sitting on the couch with a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking completely unsurprised to see me. I was wondering when you'd come back, he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I dropped my bag by the door and crossed my arms. I'm not staying. He smirked. Of course not. I exhaled slowly. I want a divorce. He leaned back, watching me with that same calculating gaze that had always unsettled me. Do you? I clenched my fists. This marriage was never real, Daniel. You knew that. I knew that. I don't love you. I never have. He sighed, setting his glass down. And yet we're still here. Not for long. He studied me, then shook his head with a dry chuckle. You're finally ready to fight, huh? I frowned. What's that supposed to mean? It means, he said, standing up, that for the first time since we got married, you actually look like someone who gives a damn. I hated that he wasn't wrong. For years I had been drifting, pretending, surviving. But now, after everything, after Elise, after the betrayal, I finally felt awake. And I wasn't going to let Daniel control me anymore. I don't care what you try to do, I said firmly. I'm leaving. He smirked. And what about your parents? What about your reputation? Do you really think they'll just let you walk away without consequences? I swallowed hard. My parents had forced me into this marriage to keep up appearances, to maintain the perfect image of their family. A divorce, especially under these circumstances, would be a scandal. But I didn't care anymore. I'll deal with it, I said. Daniel studied me for a long moment. Then to my surprise he shrugged. Fine. I blinked. Fine. You want out? You've got it. He walked over to the bar, refilling his glass. I'll have my lawyers draft the papers. I narrowed my eyes. Just like that. He smirked over the rim of his glass. Just like that. I didn't trust him. Not for a second. But I wasn't going to argue. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. Ava. I hesitated, glancing back. You never really loved her, you know? He said, watching me with amusement. My stomach twisted. What? Elise, he continued, sipping his drink. If you really loved her, you wouldn't have kept her a secret. You would have fought for her. You would have chosen her over all of this from the beginning. I hated how easily he could get under my skin. I shook my head. You don't know anything about love, Daniel. He smiled. Slow and knowing. Maybe not. But neither do you. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I grabbed my bag, walked out the door, and never looked back. The divorce was finalized months later. My parents were furious, the media spun their stories, and Daniel, true to his word, let me go without a fight. As for Elise, I never saw her again. Sometimes I wondered if she regretted it, if she ever thought about me the way I thought about her in the quiet moments. But it didn't matter anymore. I had spent years pretending to be someone I wasn't. Now, for the first time in my life, I was free. And that was enough.